where we came from. And I want to approach it from two different ways of thinking about the subject. One is traditional genealogy, which has been around for hundreds of years and uses methods of written records and whatnot. And the other is much more recent. It's only been around for a couple of decades, and that's genetic analysis, or the examination of the DNA of individuals. So this will be the outline of what we're going to talk about tonight. I'm going to start with a genealogical anecdote from my own life, just to show you why I got involved in this and how it might benefit you. We'll talk very briefly about what is DNA, only so that we're all kind of on the same page when I talk about the next topic. And that'll be the DNA testing companies that are out there and what kinds of tests they can do for you to tell you what your DNA says about yourself. I'll only be able to cover a few of the companies. Then we're going to take a big leap to the history of our species. How did the human species, Homo sapiens, begin? Where did it begin? And what do we know about it today from DNA of certain ancient humans that we didn't know even 15 years ago? I'm going to introduce you to some ancient humans who lived thousands or tens of thousands of years ago whose DNA has been recovered. And then I'm going to talk briefly about the DNA of the British, because a lot of us have British ancestry, and after all, we're living among Brits even if we don't have British ancestry. I can't cover the whole world, so I picked one narrow little aisle to talk about. And then at the end, I'm going to show you a 53-generation genealogy, each and every stage of which is backstopped by what I consider to be reliable documentation from one source or another. 53 generations, reliably backstopped. So let's start. All right, what hooked me on trying to relate genealogy and genetics? In October of 2012, a little over 2 years ago, I wasn't really interested in genealogy. I had paid a little bit of attention to it several years earlier, put some data into my laptop, and a virus wiped it out. And I was so disgusted I just gave up on genealogy. But in October 2012, I've been reading about these tests that are available that tell you how much Neanderthal DNA you have in your genes. And I thought, that would be fun. I'll send my DNA away and see how much of a Neanderthal I am. 2 months later, during that dead period between Christmas and New Year's when nothing much is happening in London, I was sitting around feeling a little bored, and I decided for some reason to think about my genealogy again. And I got on the internet and I started trying to trace some people in my father's line of descent. In December 2012, what little I knew was that my great-grandfather was a man named Julius Herrmann, or Julius Herrmann in Germany, where he was born. He was the Herrmann who came to America, where my family is located, and he came on a ship from Hamburg, but that didn't tell me anything because 1 million Germans sailed from the port of Hamburg to America in the 19th century. He arrived in New York in 1867, and I knew that Julius Herrmann and all the later Herrmanns in America were Lutherans. In fact, I was confirmed in the Lutheran Church as a teenager. Don't laugh. And looking on the internet in December of 2012, the other thing I knew from regular genealogical records was that Julius Herrmann had a father named Bernhard Herrmann back in Germany. And then doing some internet research in December of 2012, I discovered that there was a famous man named Bernhard Anton Herrmann who lived in Hamburg in the 19th century. He was famous because he was the head of the theater there. He wrote plays of his own. He translated plays. Very important man in cultural life. But he was from a Jewish family. However, further internet research showed that the famous Bernhard Anton Herrmann had converted to Lutheranism as a young man. So this raised the question, were these two men, my 3 times great-grandfather, named Bernhard Herrmann, and the famous Bernhard Anton Herrmann, one and the same person? The arrival of the results of my DNA test suggested the answer. So lo and behold, in January of 2013, my DNA test came back from the company National Geographic's Genome 2.0. And this is one of the things they provided. It's a little fuzzy, but let me tell you what it shows. This is what my Y chromosome, which was handed down from my father and his father and his father and his father all the way back into the past. My Y chromosome has a certain thing on it called the P58 marker, which makes it very, very rare among people of European background. Only about 1% of the people in Europe have it. But it's very common in these areas which are highlighted in orange and red and yellow. In other words, in the Levant, you know, the area of Jordan, Israel, Syria, that sort of region, in Yemen, on the South Arabian Peninsula, and so on. But the other interesting thing about the P58 marker, there's a lot of literature about it because it also happens to be associated with about half of all Ashkenazi Jewish men who self-identify as Kohanim, as members of the priestly caste. By tradition, the Kohanim believe that they have descended in a direct paternal line from the biblical priest Aaron. And lo and behold, about 50% of men who say they are Kohanim, Ashkenazi Jewish men, have the P58 marker. Well, that was kind of interesting. So I then retained some genealogists in Hamburg to try to investigate further for me. Because after all, I'm sitting there thinking, well, you know, I'm a Lutheran, how could I be a Kohanim? That notorious anti-Semite Martin Luther would be outraged to learn this. So I hired some German genealogists who went to the archives of the major Lutheran church in Hamburg, and about a month and a half later, they came back with some very interesting information. What they found was that in 1820, a man named Bernard Anton Herrmann, in 1820, a man named Bernard Herschel, who was Jewish, got a nice young Roman Catholic girl pregnant, converted to Lutheranism, and married. So what you have is the records in Germany are telling me that a Jewish man impregnated a Roman Catholic girl and turned into a Lutheran. God works in mysterious ways. So, knowing that this Bernard Herschel had become Bernard Anton Herrmann, I asked the German genealogists to look further into the records, and they discovered that about 6 years after his conversion, he and his now wife, Maria Ganganelli, the Italian girl, had another son. And it's hard for you to read it, but this other son's name was Johann Friedrich Julius Heinrich Herrmann. And in the tradition in that family, the first couple of names aren't really used. He was known in the family as Julius or Julius. And indeed, that Julius Herrmann, born in 1826 to Bernard Anton Herrmann, 40 years later, sailed to New York, and he is my 2 times great-grandfather. So there's still this open question, how can it be that, that I have this P58 marker, and the next step we did was to look at the records of the Jewish community in Hamburg, and with a little bit of work, my genealogist found out that Bernard Anton Herrmann's father was Michael Herschel. Here you see me at his grave in the Jewish cemetery in Wandsbek in Germany, in Hamburg. He was a merchant. His father was Mayor Wolf Herschel, who was a banker. And in turn, his father was Rabbi Wolf Herschel. So indeed, my 6 times great-grandfather, Rabbi Wolf Herschel, was a Kohanim, a member of the priestly caste. And now it all makes sense. The genealogy and the genes unite to make a consistent story. So at that point, my son Gabriel demanded a bar mitzvah, and I was hooked on genetic genealogy. So traditional genealogy relies on surnames and ancient records, whether church records or state records or whatever. I'm just going to flash through this real quickly. If you look at it, you can see that church records began in England in about the mid-16th century, the same roughly in Scotland, about a century later in Ireland. Civil records much later in the mid-19th century. But all of those are dependent upon surnames. They're almost always indexed by the surname, and the surname almost always traces the male line. So what do you do if, as in my case, for example, there's been a change in the surname from Herschel to Herrmann? That can throw you off. What if there's been an adoption? What if the records are lost, which is so often the case, especially in some of the countries like in Europe where they were ravaged by war. So traditional genealogy can often run into dead ends, and that's why you might be tempted to see what DNA can do to help you along. DNA sometimes can get you past the brick walls that you get from traditional genealogy. So briefly now, I'm going to run through what is DNA. It'll be too simple for some of you. I'm sorry, but I just need to make sure we all are on the same page. So what is DNA? Well, you all heard about the double helix. Molecules of DNA are in this form of a double helix. I like to think of it instead as a twisted ladder. All that matters in the structure is the rungs of the ladder. They're called nucleotide bases. They're bonded together on opposite sides of the double helix. They have the names adenine, thymine, guanine, and cytosine, but they're more typically just referred to as A, T, G, and C. And your entire genetic recipe, which interacts with your environment and makes you who you are, consists of just a string of nucleotide bases, which can be represented by the letters A, G, C, C, T, G, A, G, 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 C, T, T, on and on. 3.1 billion of those makes up a set of 23 chromosomes. That's what DNA essentially is all about, those strings of nucleotide bases. Where is it found? Well, here's a representation of a cell on the left. In the nucleus of a cell, which is shown in blue, you have 23 pairs of chromosomes. Chromosomes are long molecules of DNA bound up with proteins and other things that make them do their job. And that's the bulk, that's the vast bulk of your DNA in the nucleus of each and every one of your 30 trillion cells, with some exceptions like blood cells, red blood cells. If you could string them out nice and neat, and you can with some techniques, your 23 pairs of chromosomes would look like this. Traditionally, they're numbered 1 through 22 in descending length. And then the 23rd pair, down here, are the sex chromosomes. I hope you can all see it. I'm sorry if it's a little bit too low. Essentially, if you're born with one X chromosome and one Y chromosome, you will usually develop into what we traditionally think of as a male. There's some exceptions. If you have two X chromosomes, you will usually develop into what we traditionally think of as a female. Again, there's some exceptions. And then there's some odd cases with 3 chromosomes or 1 chromosome. Too complicated to discuss that now. It's a whole other talk. There's other DNA, though, in your body, and that's in what are called the mitochondria. Here again is a cell. And now the mitochondria are shown. They're little organelles located in the body of the cell. This only shows a few of them, but in reality, most of your cells would have 100 or 200 or even 1,000 mitochondria. They're the energy factories that give the cell the energy for its metabolism and all the other things it has to do. And inside each mitochondrium is a little loop of DNA, but it's only 16,500 base pairs long compared to your chromosomes, which would have hundreds of millions or at least tens of millions of base pairs on each of them. Now, you may have been hearing about mitochondrial problems in the news lately with the stories about the 3-parent babies. There's a bill going through Parliament to allow the creation of babies that would have 3 parents, in which one woman would provide a healthy ovum with healthy mitochondria. The second woman would provide 23 chromosomes for the nucleus, and a man 23 more chromosomes for the nucleus. So you would then have an individual born with basically 3 genetic parents. Now this would be a nightmare for genealogists because all of our family trees have only 2 boxes as parents, but it's an even bigger nightmare for ethicists and people of religious belief because there are enormously complex implications of this sort of thing. Another talk on another night. So summing up, your DNA comes 23 chromosomes from your mom into the nucleus of a fertilized egg, another 23 chromosomes from your dad, but the mitochondria in that egg cell, that ovum, are all from your mom. So your mitochondria are a way to trace your female ancestry solely. All right, so with that in mind, I want to talk about some of the DNA testing companies and the types of tests they do and what those tests can do for you if you're interested in genealogy. First of all, it doesn't hurt to have a DNA test, at least not with these companies. You don't have to give blood. You either scrape a few skin cells off your cheek with a little scrubber, or you spend a couple of minutes spitting into a test tube until you get a nice full test tube of it. So it doesn't hurt, but it does cost money, and a considerable amount of money. I'm going to talk about the 3 biggest companies. There's a 4th one that's now making a push into the UK, but I don't have time to get into it. The first one that I want to mention is called Family Tree DNA. They have over 700,000 people that they've administered a test to. Unfortunately for many of us in this room, only 30% of their testees are outside the US, so it's a little less likely to help you find an ancestor if your ancestry is all European. The very basic test is $99, but that's not a complete test. They actually run it sort of like a Chinese restaurant menu. You can buy a bunch of different types of tests. Each one costs a little bit more money. What they will tell you, what their test will tell you, is your ethnic makeup in the sense of are you most like people from Europe or from Asia or from Africa, or what percentage are you of each of those types? It'll identify for you people in their customer base whose DNA is in some way similar to yours, so they might be near relatives of yours. And it gives you the chance to communicate with them if you like. It'll provide you raw data if you want to actually look at your DNA, your SNPs, but I don't think most of you would want to take the time to do that. The next company I'd like to mention is 23andMe. They have just begun to make a huge push in the UK, starting in November, when they got approval to do their DNA testing here. They have over 800,000 people. Again, most of them are in the US, only 10% not, but that's going to change very soon. It's 125 pounds, not cheap. They will tell you what percentage you are made up of archaic hominins. In other words, Neanderthals, as I showed you earlier in my case, or I told you earlier in my case. They will also tell you your percentage ethnic makeup. They'll identify near relatives you can then get in touch with if you like. They'll give you the raw data. And what they do that's different from any of the others is they will give you health information. So for example, they will tell you what your risk is for things like Parkinson's disease, Alzheimer's disease, breast cancer, ovarian cancer, a whole bunch of metabolic and blood-related diseases. You don't have to open up that data if you don't want to know it. In fact, I wanted to see what my Alzheimer's risk was, and I had to actually say, yes, I really want to see it 3 times before I finally got it. The news was good, by the way. Which is why I can't remember what I was going to say. So then another one of the big companies is National Geographic. That's the one that I took first, and it's a scientific organization. It's not a commercial entity. They have now over 700,000 people all over the world. And they're really organized for scientific purposes. They get you to pay them to analyze DNA so they can see patterns of mutations occurring all around the world, and they write scientific papers. They will tell you your ethnic makeup, what percentage you are European, Asian, etc. They'll give you your raw data, but believe me, it's very, very hard to get it. But they'll tell you nothing that's of any value for genealogy. There are other companies, but I just don't have time to talk about them. Basically, they all tend to do these kinds of tests. If you're a man, they'll test your Y chromosome separately in some cases, or together as part of a package. They test everybody's mitochondrial DNA, because everybody gets mitochondria from their moms. And they test, some of them, or all of them, in one way or another, will test the autosomal DNA. That's chromosomes 1 through 22. And it's the autosomal DNA that can be helpful for unraveling genealogical puzzles back 5 or 6 generations, not much more than that for technical reasons we can talk about in the question and answer if you'd like. But that's where you get the bulk of your assistance in finding lost relatives. The Y-DNA can rule out that somebody who claimed to be your father was your father. The mitochondrial DNA, well, you know, you might be a changeling and you might find out that you are not the child of the person you thought you were your mother, or whatever. But that's sort of a rare event. This is an example of what you get from National Geographic. They told me, for example, that I'm 2.5% Neanderthal, whereas the average in the population generally is about 2%. So I'm a bit more of a brute than the average person. They also told me that I have 1.2% of my DNA from another archaic species, the Denisovans. We'll talk about them a little later, but the Denisovans were a species that were capable of mating with our species, Homo sapiens. They were only discovered about 5-6 years ago. We know next to nothing about them. But they claim, National Geographic claims I'm 1.2 Denisovan. I think they're wrong, but you'll maybe see why in a minute. I think that might be a mistake. Now, another company, Family Tree DNA, sent me this. So here they show to what extent I have DNA that is like Europeans or other peoples. And so, for example, they show I'm very much like many people in the UK, some Scandinavians, some Western Europeans, a little bit of Southern Europeans. Now, you could have told me that just looking at me. You didn't need to test my DNA, right? But what you couldn't have told me is that about 7% of my genome is quite a bit like people in Turkey and the Caucasus. And 2% is quite a bit like people in Afghanistan. And I'm still puzzled by that. But I'm working on it. I'm working on it. Here's what they show you in terms of matching people who might be relatives. And this is probably, if you're interested in genealogy, this is the function that is of most use. So, for example, here they show me ranked according to the person who has the most similarity in DNA to me, and then the next most, and so on. They give you the name of the person if he has or she has consented to disclose their name. They give you an estimate of what this person might be to you. Here, Dr. Jean-Pierre Schachter, who lives in Canada, is said to be a possible second cousin to fourth cousin, meaning we might share a great-grandparent to a 3 times great-grandparent. But in fact, I now have a database of relatives that includes over 500 people, and so far, he's not in it. And every attempt so far by me to use independent means to verify this has proven to be a futility. One day, I might decide to contact him, but I have to first decide that I really do want to disclose my identity to him. But that's the sort of thing you'll get. And for me, so far, it hasn't produced an unknown relative, but I know there's one person in this room at least who has used one of these testing companies and who has found and contacted a distant relative he didn't know he had. All right, caution. Your DNA is highly, highly personal to you and is something that you really ought to think very carefully about whether you want to share with anyone. When you get your DNA tested, it goes into the computer of the company that tests it. And we all know that hackers are hacking everybody's computer systems these days. If they can get into defense-related computers, banks, or highly sensitive, highly encrypted databases, there certainly has to be a risk that hackers will one day get into the company whose DNA is stored in their computer. And you have to decide whether you want to run that risk or not. I have, but you may not want to. Another thing that you have to be aware of is there can be very unpleasant surprises. You might discover in your family history what's called by the genealogists a non-paternity event, also called a false paternity event. That's when a putative father isn't actually the father. And that came up recently in the very famous case of Richard III, when his DNA was analyzed from the bones that were discovered in Leicestershire. It was found that somewhere in his ancestry, up his male line to Edward I, and down the male line through the Dukes of Somerset, all the way to people living today, somewhere there was at least one non-paternity event. And it could have, we don't know where it happened, but it could have happened as far back as prior to the Tudors. So it is possible that all of the Tudors were pretenders, that they had no right to the title. I'm sure people are going to work on elaborating on that. Another unpleasant surprise might come if you get the health concern, if you get the health information from 23andMe. You maybe don't want to deal with that. That's your choice. There can be breaches of confidentiality that were not hacking of computers, but for other reasons. People are taking their raw genetic data from these companies and putting them up on unencrypted, open websites on the web, asking other people to see if they match them. And what's been done is people, for both malicious reasons and just for research purposes, have looked at this publicly available DNA data, and in some cases, anonymous sperm donors have been identified against their wishes. Biological parents of adoptees have been identified against their wishes. In one case, a researcher at MIT was able to break the anonymity of a medical research, a clinical trial that involved some hereditary disease, and was able to find the identities of a large number of the test subjects who had been promised confidentiality, and it was capable of being broken. Now, he didn't publish the data, but he published the fact that it could be done. So think carefully if you decide to have your DNA tested. Think even more carefully if you decide to share it with anyone. All right. So from this discussion of DNA testing, I'd like to now jump all the way back in time to the history of our species. And we're going to talk a little bit about the history of our species from the standpoint of what DNA, not only of ancient people who are long dead, but DNA of living people all around the world today can tell us about the history of our species. This very, very complicated graphic is not intended for you to master within the few seconds it's going to be up here. But what it's showing is that if you take the mitochondrial DNA of thousands of people alive today, living in all parts of the world, you find that there are mutations that are clustered in certain geographic areas. And using the methods of population genetics, which are extremely sophisticated statistical techniques, you can plot back the sequence of these mutations to when they arose from prior mutations, and they all point toward the very, very clear conclusion that Homo sapiens originated in Africa, probably East Africa, and about 60,000 years ago, Homo sapiens left Africa, some of them left Africa, and radiated out, eventually going to all the other continents on the globe, except, of course, Antarctica. Down here, you'll see some color codes and some letters. Mitochondrial DNA falls into a little over 20 different groupings called haplogroups. Each of these color codes shows a different haplogroup. There's one other thing on this graphic I want to point to. I don't know if you can read it. It's got the word Eve in quotation marks. What that refers to is that there was, at one point in history, one woman from whom all living human beings are directly descended in the matrilineal line. A female direct ancestor of all of the 7 billion living humans today. The pattern of mutations points to the very high probability that mitochondrial Eve, our common female ancestor, lived in Africa. there are a lot of different studies that have tried to estimate her age. I've looked at a lot of the papers, and in my judgment, the best of the papers is one that came out in 2013 and estimates mitochondrial Eve lived 124,000 years ago, plus or minus 20,000 on either side. So about 124,000 years ago, a single woman lived who became the ancestor, the female ancestor of all of us. Doesn't mean all the other women had no ancestry that survived. It just means that there was a break in the straight matrilineal line. So there might have been women living at her time who had children that were all male, or only the males survived, and their children continued. And we could be descended from them, but it's not a straight matrilineal line. Likewise, if you look at the haplogroups, the types of mutations in the Y chromosome of men all around the world, you get a similar kind of pattern. Don't try to cipher it all out, it's just too complex. But the point is, once again, it points to our species originating in Africa and radiating out of Africa into all of the other continents. So the male chromosome corroborates what the female mitochondria show. And once again, there is an individual, he's called Y-DNA Adam. The pointers indicate that he was also in Africa. Again, I've looked at the studies to try to put a date on him. I think the best study there estimates that he lived about 138,000 years ago, plus or minus about 15,000 years either side. So you've got Adam being in Africa 138,000 years ago, and about 14,000 years later you've got Eve. Sorry, Genesis, it just doesn't work. All right, so how did they leave Africa? I think that the best hypothesis is the one that's had the consensus in the last few years, which is that a small group of Homo sapiens left Africa across what's called the Bab el-Mandeb, a strait of water that separates this region of Africa, Djibouti, I think, from Yemen and the Arabian Peninsula, about 60,000 years ago, give or take. And at that time, a lot of the water in the world's oceans had been sucked up and turned into snow and ice because we were starting the glaciation again. So the waters were lower. Right now that strait is 20 miles wide and very dangerous to try to cross. Back when our ancestors crossed that strait, the water was lower, but you still could not see straight across. So some very brave souls, perhaps floating on rafts, or maybe they had invented rudimentary canoes, we don't know, sailed out, noticed there was something on the other side, and stayed for a while. Maybe they went back and forth, probably they did. But ultimately, a group of them stayed, flourished, reproduced, and their population expanded. Now, at that time, Saudi Arabia, or the Arabian Peninsula, was very lush. The glaciation in the northern hemisphere had changed the pattern of winds, so there was a lot of rain and there was a lot of vegetation. And at least along the coastline, they would have had no trouble finding relatively decent conditions. And the pathway seems to have been along the coast of the Arabian Peninsula, around the Persian Gulf, onto India, and through Southeast Asia, which is off the chart here, and all the way down to Australia, within about 10,000 years, making it to Australia. This is, I think, the most widely viewed path of human migration. You might see this little thing up here. I had to add that 2 weeks ago, riding home in a cab. I heard on the radio that a new paper came out in Nature which reports on the finding of a 55,000-year-old Homo sapien skull in a cave in Israel. And now some people are saying, oh, well, that proves they went across the Sinai, actually. But no, it doesn't. I think, first of all, when you find a skull, you don't know which way his feet were pointing when he got there. The Sinai was probably a desert at that time, and I do think the better explanation is humans came up around this way, and that's how they got to Israel 55,000 years ago. But we don't need to settle that question tonight. All right, so what did they find when they left Africa and entered into these other continents? They found people they could mate with. Well, people in a sense. They found another species, the Neanderthals, and Neanderthals had a distinct genome, but it wasn't so distinct that we couldn't successfully breed with them, at least for a little while. So Homo sapiens, leaving Africa, met up with Neanderthals, bred with them, and had children. And that's why even today, all of us who have ancestry from outside of the African continent will have 2 to 2.5% DNA in our own genomes. People in Africa, indigenous Africans, have no detectable Neanderthal DNA, unless of course they had a recent European come to stay with them. So we know that the mating between Homo sapiens and Neanderthals had to occur somewhere outside of Africa, and we have a pretty good idea in Central Asia, and maybe even as clearly delineated as the Caucasus. But humans also found, or encountered, another species who are called the Denisovans. And these are the people that, well, this is the species that was only discovered about 6 years ago. We know next to nothing about them, but they had a distinct genome as well. The Denisovans are much closer to Neanderthals in their DNA than they are to us. But the Denisovan DNA that we find in living humans today is found almost entirely, almost exclusively in people living in Melanesia or Australia, places like Papua New Guinea or those places. And those people tend to have between 1 and 6% Denisovan DNA in their genomes on top of the 2% Neanderthal. Because the living people with Denisovan DNA are almost exclusively in Australia and Melanesia, I think the test result I got was a mistake, but I may be wrong. We'll find out someday. This is more or less the pattern of what the species, where the species were back then. I think it's a little bit outdated, but basically the Neanderthals occupied all of Europe and a good part of Western Asia. The Denisovans, this should probably be not only East Asia, but also should be showing Southeast Asia. I think that's probably where the encounter was. And then humans came out of Africa and bumped into the Neanderthals first, and then a smaller subset of humans went probably down into Southeast Asia where they bumped into the Denisovans. But that's, it's early days, we don't really know this for sure. So we do know a few things about Neanderthals. This is a reconstruction of a Neanderthal girl. Now we know the shape of her face because we have lots and lots of Neanderthal skulls, and forensic anthropologists have a pretty good methodology for reconstructing what a face looks like. But what we know from her DNA is, as you see here, she had fair skin, she had red hair, and she had blue eyes. We couldn't have known that from her bones. Denisovan girl, well, that's not a girl's hand you're looking at. What you're looking at is the single bone of a Denisovan from which the DNA was extracted and fully sequenced. It's a piece of the last digit, the last phalange of the little finger of a girl who was about 6 to 8 years old. And from that tiny bit of bone, enough DNA was recovered to fully sequence her genome. And we don't know anything about what she looks like because we don't have any other Denisovan bones. The only other thing we have from the Denisovans so far are 2 molars of 2 adults found in the same cave. But what we do know from her DNA is she had brown skin, not like the Neanderthals. She had brown hair, and she had brown eyes. Lots of people are looking for more Denisovan bones. We're going to learn a lot more about them in the near future, but that's all we know today. All right, so now I'm going to try to do very quickly, I'm going to introduce you to some ancient humans that existed, whose bones we found, and whose DNA we recovered. The second oldest one, I don't have time to do them all, so I'm doing the second oldest one, is Kostecki 14. You see a picture of the bones that were recovered, almost a full skeleton, a very good find. That's his skull. That's what he would look like, according to people who reproduce, the physical features from bones. What we know several interesting things about him. First of all, he lived 37,500 years ago, which was after the point in time when the human population diverged. Humans came out of Africa, went and stayed in Central Asia for a while, maybe also going on to Australia. But at some point they split, and they went west to Europe, and they went east to East Asia. And at that point, they started to diverge in their DNA. He's living after the split. He's one of those who started to head toward Europe. I mean, he was found in European Russia, but his descendants were those who went west. Most interesting about him is he has about 2.4% Neanderthal DNA, just about like us. But because the DNA from the Neanderthals is in much longer segments in his genome, it was possible to estimate how long before he lived was the interbreeding of Neanderthals that resulted in the hybrid human and Neanderthal individuals. And the answer is about 54,000 years ago. About 54,000 years ago, give or take a few thousand years, Neanderthals and Homo sapiens encountered each other, interbred, successfully produced children that survived, and that was it. After that, they may have continued to have sex, but they didn't continue to successfully produce offspring. Here's the pattern of the subsequent migration of peoples into Europe. About 46,000 years ago, they just arrived coming across from Asia Minor into Europe. They continue for a few thousand years through Europe. 42,000 years ago, they get to Kent's Cavern in Britain. That's the oldest person, modern human, we've found so far. Those people up in Kent's Cavern, though, they didn't survive. The world went into a very severe glaciation a few thousand years later, and they either died or they cleverly retreated back down to Refugia, where the climate was warmer in lower parts of Europe. The next person I want to talk about is this guy. This is a 1903 newspaper, the discovery of the skeleton of somebody who became known as Cheddar Man, because he was found in Cheddar Cave in Somerset. He lived about 10,000 years ago, so he was among those who returned to Britain after the earlier wave of people had been wiped out. We did recover his mitochondrial DNA back in the late 1990s when DNA testing was really quite primitive. It was quite amusing that they found a man named Adrian Target who was living in Somerset who had a very close mitochondrial DNA match to Cheddar Man's. But you know, that's not really a surprise because mitochondrial DNA is widespread and you'd probably find lots and lots of matches today. That's a reconstruction of what he probably looked like. And then this is the final person I want to talk about among the ancients. This is the famous Ötzi, the Iceman. He's not a fossil, he's a mummy. He was mummified in a glacier in the Tyrolean Alps and found about not quite 20 years ago, I think. Actually, a little over 20 years ago in the Tyrolean Alps. And because he was very well preserved, we were able to recover his DNA. And we actually learned a few things about him. He has a kind of a rare Y chromosome, haplogroup G, which today is not found very much in the European landmass, but is found very heavily in Corsica and Sardinia. So it appears his ancestors went off to Corsica and Sardinia and never left. But elsewhere in Europe, his male ancestors, seem to have died out. Looking at his DNA, we know he was lactose intolerant. We also know that he had certain diseases that made him prone to cardiovascular disease, heart disease. But he didn't die from that because we know he died from a hard blow to the head and an arrow in his back. Both of those were found in his remains. Austrian scientists claim they found 19 Tyrolean men alive today who share a particular genetic anomaly with him, but I don't really have more details on that. Okay, so those are the ancients I have time to tell you about. I want to talk briefly about the DNA of the British. And I'm going to focus on males, partly because there's more literature on that, and partly because male surnames are useful in genealogy, and the Y chromosome also follows the male line. There's a very large haplogroup of men all over the world called the R haplogroup. Seems to have come into existence about 27,000 years ago. It breaks up into smaller groups called R1 and R2. R1 seems to have arisen about 18,000 years ago. It's divided into R1A and R1B, and it goes on and on, slicing and dicing. Here's a map of pretty much how the R1B people came into existence in the area of sort of Western Asia. Starting about 16,000 years or so ago, they spread across Europe, and eventually a subgroup of them called R1B L21 subgroup arrived in Britain in about 2,700 years ago. Now, switching for a moment to not a genetically defined group, but a culturally defined group, here is the maximum extent of the Celtic peoples who are defined by their language as of about 2,250 years ago, about 500 years after the R1B L21 people got to Britain. And here is the current distribution today of men with the R1B L21 Y DNA. You can see that there is some suggestion of a similarity between where the Celtic people lived, which we know from archaeology and linguistic analysis, and where the R1B L21 men live today. It's suggestive, but it's not proof. Nonetheless, although it's not proven, this group has been called by a lot of people the Atlantic Celtic branch of men with that Y DNA variation. What this shows here is the darker the color, the higher percentage of men in that region with this particular Y chromosome. So you see it's very heavily represented in Ireland and Scotland. And I'm going to talk about a particular subgroup of this subgroup, which will play into the last topic we're going to talk about tonight. You can slice and dice and break down these groups an infinite number of ways. You can't possibly grasp this slide, but I just want to point out to you that one subgroup of the R1B L21 men is a subgroup called L1335. Men with the L1335 particular Y chromosome are found prominently today in southeastern Scotland, the Lowlands of Scotland, but also all throughout the British Isles. But they're of interest to me for one reason. First of all, I want to talk about who lived in the Lowlands of Scotland 2,000 years ago. This is a map from a history by the Roman historian Ptolemy showing the Celtic tribes that inhabited part of Scotland at 150 AD. And there was a tribe which Ptolemy called the Otadini, but they're actually called the Votadini. The Votadini were a Celtic tribe employed by the Romans north of Hadrian's Wall to fight the Picts. They were mercenaries to keep the Picts, who were further north, to keep the Picts at bay. So the Votadini are a known tribe, historically well documented, and they lived everywhere from Edinburgh and the Firth of Forth all the way down to Hadrian's Wall and even a little bit into Northumberland. So why do I want to talk about them? Well, there are today in Wales, not in Scotland, a group of Welsh men, a cluster of them, who have genealogical evidence that they are descended from Cneda Vladig, who was the ruler of the Votadini in 385. And they have, this cluster of Welsh men, have been tested positive for this L1335 variant. And similarly, many people living in Scotland today have that variant. Does this corroborate the Roman histories? The Roman histories say that at the end of the 4th century, the Romans paid Cneda Vladig to move with some of the Votadini from Scotland to Wales, where Cneda Vladig established the North Welsh kingdom of Gwynedd. Why did he go there? He was paid by the Romans to suppress Irish raiders. So a Scot was sent to Wales to fight the Irish on behalf of the Romans. We're all connected. We're all connected. Canetta had 8 sons, and when he died, each of them established a principality of their own in North Wales. And that brings me to the final section of the talk. And I'm going to have to do this real fast because we're running out of time. But I'm going to give you a 53 generation genealogy, and I say up here it's more believable than Genesis chapter 11. I know those of you who know me know that I often draw inspiration from the Bible, and so I went to Genesis and looked at how they lay out the genealogy there, and it's, you know, so-and-so begat so-and-so, who begat so-and-so, who begat so-and-so. So I'm going to do that, but I'm going to give you a 53 generation genealogy that's backstopped by what I consider to be reliable evidence at every stage of the 53 generations. Reasonably well documented, and I'm going to try to do it in 4 minutes. The starting point will be this genealogy of Cned of Ledig. As I said, he lived about 385 AD on into the 400s. And this genealogy was prepared by an archivist at the National Library of Wales who spent 45 years gathering up all of the genealogies of Welsh people that exist anywhere and rationalizing them and making them into a coherent pattern. And it's a 7-volume work, and I trust it. I think it's reliable. So I'm going to start with the belief that Cneda was a real person in Wales. And before I do this, 53 generations. Let's just talk about 50 generations for a minute. If at 50 generations, you have potentially 2 to the 50th power ancestors. And I know you're calculating it in your head what that is, but I'll tell you. It's a little bit more than a quadrillion, a little bit more than a billion potential ancestors. So if you had a family tree on a piece of paper that went back to 50 generations, and if you had a box, ½ inch on the side, for each of your ancestors 50 generations back, that piece of paper would stretch from one side of the orbit of Pluto to the other side of the orbit of Pluto. Now obviously we don't have that many ancestors, and the reason is there was so much intermarriage between cousins and second cousins and so on. The genealogy collapses down to a much smaller group of people. But that's, in principle, how big your genealogy could be 50 generations back. And of course, 53 generations back is 8 times bigger than that. All right, so Cneda married a woman named Wall. I just want to stop here and say she is a historic person too. She's the daughter of Cole Hen, as the Welsh called him, but you English people here, you know him as Old King Cole. So Cneda married Wall, and they begat Aini on earth. I'm going to botch all this Welsh pronunciation. Aini on earth begat Cadwal and Lawhir. Cadwal and Lawhir begat Melgwyn Gwynedd. Melgwyn Gwynedd begat Ruin. Stopping here, we're now at 49 generations, so now we're within the orbit of Pluto. Ruin begat Belai. Belai begat Iago. Iago begat Cadfan. Cadfan begat Cadwallon. Cadwallon begat Cadwallader. Cadwallader begat Idwal Irrich. Idwal Irrich begat Rodri Malwanog. Rodri Malwanog begat Conan Tendiathe. Conan Tendiathe begat Mervyn Firch. Mervyn Firch begat Rodri. Rodri More, Rodri the Great, begat Cattle. Cattle begat Hul. Hul Da. Hul Da means Hul the Good. He was the king who codified Welsh law about 800 AD. Hul Da begat Owain. Owain begat Einion. Einion begat Cattle. Cattle begat Tudor More. Tudor More begat Griffith ap Rhys. Griffith ap Rhys begat Rhys ap Gruffydd. And I want to stop there for a minute. Rhys ap Gruffydd was known as Lord Rhys. He lived about 1160 or so. He was the last of the Welsh princes that had control over almost all of Wales. That's why he's known as Lord Rhys. He had a lot of wives and a lot of concubines. So I will say that he mated with several women, and one of them begat a daughter named Angarod. And there's a red asterisk here because now we're breaking the line of descent through Welsh men, because Angarod, his daughter, was married off to an Anglo-Norman, the Baron of Cyneas. Camillus is a barony in Pembrokeshire. He's an Anglo-Norman 3 generations removed from a friend, a companion of the conqueror. So now we pick up his surname, Fitzmartin. Later on they'll drop the Fitz, which means son of, and just be Martins. So anyway, William Fitzmartin begat a William, who begat a Nicholas, who begat a Robert, and then they've got on a string. Robert begat a second Robert, who begat a third Robert, who begat a fourth Robert, who begat a fifth Robert, who I think he had some imagination, and he begat an Oliver, but Oliver begat and Robert then begat a Richard, who begat a Thomas, who begat a William, who begat a Christopher, who begat a Thomas again, who begat a Robert, who begat a Nicholas, and here again we're going to stop now because Nicholas Martin had no male children who survived him. He had only daughters. So now the surname is going to change again. Nicholas Martin married a Wada, who was a very rich woman. They begat somebody named Jane Martin, and she married a man named Edward Richards, who was the manor of Yarraland on the Isle of Wight and also owned a lot of property in Southampton. So now the line is going to follow the surname Richards. So Edward Richards begat an Edward II. Edward II begat an Edward III. Edward III, in 1636, got on a boat with a bunch of Puritans and sailed to Massachusetts, where he married and begat a son named Nathaniel Richards. Nathaniel begat Jeremiah, Jeremiah begat John, John begat William, William begat Lemuel the Elder, Lemuel the Elder begat Lemuel the Younger, Lemuel the Younger begat Walter, and now Walter breaks the pattern. We've been seeing English people marrying English people for several generations, but now Walter Richards marries a young Irish girl named Ellen Ryan, and they begat George Richards. And George Richards marries a German girl named Flora Flock, and they begat Marjorie. And Marjorie Richards met Warren Herrmann in the course of and they begat this guy. So we started out, I took you up my father's line as far as I've gone so far with genealogy and DNA. We jumped to the history of our species. Then we came down the line of our species through Central Asia, through Europe, into the UK, down through Wales, into America, and I arrived at where we started from, back at me. I think there's nothing exceptional about my genealogy. It's just that I've had more time to search it out than perhaps you've done with yours. But I think that you might find some very interesting things in yours if you did the same. But I think at this point, it would be appropriate to end on this note.